On the 28th of February 1991, the Gulf War came to an end, but a new conflict was about to begin. The following day, US President Bush made a statement to the people of Iraq. In my view, the Iraqi people should put Saddam aside. At the very same time, Shia in the south and Kurds in the north took control of much of the country. Saddam's regime was on the ropes, but the uprisings would end in disaster. In this final episode of our Gulf War series, we'll explore the aftermath of the war. Why did the uprisings fail? Why didn't the coalition intervene? And how did the Gulf War set the stage for the 2003 invasion of Iraq? The uprisings in Iraq had been coming for some time. The horrors of the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, plus Iraq's economic crisis, had built resentment, but the spark came from defeat in the Gulf War. The Iraqi army retreating into southern Iraq were joined in the streets by angry civilians. Together, they took control of Iraq's major cities. Basra was the first to fall on the 1st of March, with uprisings soon spreading from the Shia-dominated south to the Kurdish-dominated north. At the height of the revolt, Saddam's regime had control of just 4 of Iraq's 18 provinces. However, the rebellion was doomed to failure. Opposition groups were unprepared and uncoordinated, and the expected coalition assistance never came. This allowed Saddam's Republican Guard, who had survived the Gulf War, to fight back.
Saddam responded with overwhelming force, employing military and security forces to crush the rebellions. This came at the cost of thousands of civilian lives. Fearing a renewal of the 1988 poison gas attacks, during which Saddam used chemical weapons on Kurdish civilians, many families chose to abandon their villages. Tens of thousands of Shias and more than 1 million Kurds were driven from their homes, fleeing south into the southern marshes and towards Iran and Turkey. Turkey had initially closed its borders, and with the number of civilians fleeing rapidly growing, it is thought that up to 1,000 Kurds died each day, with little or no access to food, water and shelter. Saddam effectively suppressed the uprisings, but through his violence he caused a humanitarian crisis and further alienated the Iraqi population.
Despite Bush's encouragement for the Iraqis to take matters into their own hands, the US did not intervene the way the rebels had hoped. The stated objectives of the Gulf War were very narrow. They never mentioned the removal of Saddam from power, and this was key to keeping such a diverse coalition together. Still, many Iraqis felt let down. In the end, some 20,000 Kurds and 30 to 60,000 Shia had been killed. Memories of 1991 would lead the Shia population to be less than welcoming when the Americans returned in 2003. That said, members of the coalition did not stand by entirely. In April, British and American forces entered northern Iraq as part of Operations Haven and Provide Comfort, along with other nations. They aimed to protect Kurdish refugees and provide humanitarian assistance. This was soon followed by the establishment of no-fly zones in both northern and southern Iraq, which in turn helped facilitate the establishment of an autonomous region in Iraqi Kurdistan in 1992. This left US troops in the Middle East for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, the people who lived in the region were facing up to a different kind of disaster.
One of Saddam's last acts of the war was to order the destruction of Kuwait's oil fields. Set ablaze, hundreds of oil wells, storage tanks and oil refineries polluted the surrounding air and water, resulting in one of the greatest man-made environmental disasters of the 20th century. The oil fires released huge amounts of toxic chemicals into the air, which increased the atmospheric pollution in Kuwait, lasting for months and causing a rise in respiratory illnesses. It took 10 months to put out the last fires, with clouds of smoke further damaging crops and polluting water supplies. At the same time, millions of barrels of crude oil from Iraqi tankers and oil storage facilities were deliberately spilled into the sea, damaging hundreds of kilometres of coastline. The region's environment had become a major casualty in this war.
By now, Iraq was reeling from United Nations sanctions. These had been imposed after Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. Combined with the destruction of Iraq's infrastructure in the coalition bombing campaign, These sanctions crippled Iraq's economy, and GDP fell continuously until 1996. This had a catastrophic effect on Iraqi civilians, with rising rates of malnutrition and disease and shortages in medical supplies, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The sanctions were controversial at the time, but they remained in place due to a link with Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
Following the end of the war, the United Nations Special Commission outlined that Iraq must destroy its WMDs and dismantle all research development and manufacturing facilities that had survived coalition bombing. Until this process was complete, UN sanctions would remain in force. Believing that appearing to comply with the UN resolutions would bring a faster end to the sanctions, Saddam took the decision to partially declare the size of his country's WMD capacity and destroy the rest. This included chemical and biological weapons, ballistic missiles, and crucially any paperwork which showed that this weaponry had ever existed. The destruction took place in secret in 1991, just as UN inspection teams began arriving in the country. But with no records to show, how could it be proven or verified that these weapons had been destroyed? This fostered an atmosphere of distrust, and by 2003 had raised international suspicions from world leaders that Iraq still possessed an ongoing WMD program.
Throughout this period, US policy towards Iraq continued to evolve. In 1996, the succeeding president, Bill Clinton, authorised the CIA to take covert action to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Then, in 1998, Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act, declaring America's commitment to regime change in Iraq.
So long as Saddam remains in power, he threatens the well-being of his people, the peace of his region, the security of the world. The best way to end that threat, once and for all, is with the new Iraqi government.
The 1990s had ushered in a so-called unipolar moment. The international community, led by the United States, became far more interventionist in the face of conflict, such as those in the former Yugoslavia. It coincided with a period in which global conflict became more visible and urgent to people all around the world.
This t-shirt was worn by John Hinckley, who worked for the BBC as a videotape editor, responsible for editing stories in the Gulf before they were released back to London and aired on television. A huge number of reporters and news agencies were based in Saudi Arabia, covering the Gulf War as it unfolded. Sky News and ITN formed part of the British TV news pool, which John was in with the BBC. News pools were created during this time to group together several news organisations who would share their images for broadcast to all members within the pool to use and edit as needed. Viewers back home could watch each stage of the Gulf War as it happened in real time. New advancements in satellite technology allowed journalists to broadcast live from the battlefield. Images of Scud missiles flying overhead, service personnel preparing for deployment, and general devastation inflicted from the coalition's air campaign filled television screens across the globe. Television coverage changed war reporting, making war much more immediate and real.
But there was resistance to America's status as global superpower. In particular, Islamist extremists were becoming more and more frustrated with America's continuing presence in the Gulf, its sanctions against Iraq, and its support for Israel. In February 1998, Osama bin Laden issued a fatwa as the leader of terror group Al-Qaeda, which called for the indiscriminate killing of American people. This was followed in August by the bombing of 2 US embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, killing 224 people. It was the beginning of a new era of international security. Meanwhile, the veterans of the Gulf War were beginning to notice worrying symptoms about their health. This soon became known as Gulf War syndrome. Symptoms ranged from chronic fatigue, headaches, skin rashes, or nerve pain, amongst other things, with many believing that this was a result of exposures they had encountered in theatre. Possible theories included the use of depleted uranium, accidental exposure to nerve agents, and the exposure to fumes from the burning oil wells.
Several studies have failed to find conclusive evidence to support these theories or a specific cause for this phenomenon. However, one recent American report found that exposure to the nerve agent sarin was the cause of illness in some American veterans, with a weakened variant of a gene that normally allows bodies to better break down the nerve gas. An MOD spokesperson said at the time that although we have no plans to conduct further studies, we continue to monitor any Gulf War research that is published around the world. This is the Gulf War Medal. It was awarded to British personnel for 30 days continuous service between the 2nd of August 1990 and the 7th of March 1991, and an additional bar was awarded to those who served 7 days during the combat phase of the conflict. The light blue, red and dark blue ribbon represents each of the 3 armed services, and they are also represented on this side of the medal with an anchor, an eagle and a rifle. This one is a specimen for the Imperial War Museum from the MOD, but 45,000 medals awarded to individuals had their names impressed on the rim in capital letters.
On the 11th of September 2001, Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airliners and used them to attack the United States. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. Soon afterwards, US President George Bush declared a war on terror. He invaded Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda were based, but soon American attention began to pivot towards Iraq. Bush's father had led America in the Gulf War. He now became determined to finish the job and oust Saddam. Bush claimed that Iraq was still in possession of weapons of mass destruction and that they might give these weapons to terrorists for use against America. Having disposed of his weapons in secret, Saddam was unable to prove otherwise. Soon, US troops returned to Kuwait to prepare for an invasion. There, they found a nation that was still scarred from the Gulf War.
This is a VS-50 anti-personnel mine, which was recovered during mine clearance operations in Kuwait following the end of the Gulf War. It's made up of 3 sections, including a bottom section, which contains the explosive charge, a middle section, which contains the fuse and safety arming mechanism, and the top section, which has the rubber pressure pad. A continuing downward force on the pressure pad lasting 1/10 of a second would eventually detonate the charge, meaning they could be scattered from a helicopter or vehicle without any major issues. It's also encased in plastic and contains very little metal, meaning it is extremely difficult to detect. Iraqi forces laid almost 2 million mines in Kuwait. Clearing them proved to be a major challenge for the men and women who were deployed to the region soon after the completion of ground operations. More than 30 years later, the shadow of the conflict looms large. Many areas still contain landmines and unexploded ordnance, which continue to take civilian lives.
In March 2003, a US-led coalition invaded Iraq and ousted Saddam from power. The invasion, and all the chaos that followed, was intimately linked to the Gulf War. The events of 1990 and 91 changed our world, impacting on geopolitics, international relations and global security, as well as thousands of human lives. The Gulf War may be remembered as a short one, but its impact is still with us today.